Hi everyone. I'm Mark. I am the co-founder of the TUM Blockchain Club, which we founded this semester, and from Dashpoint, a festival startup. And yeah, currently in Mexico City, we organize a hackosphere with the BAF, and yes, and today we have Camila from the Graph, which we can interview, ask some questions. And yeah, let me shortly introduce BAF first. BAF, the Blockchain Acceleration Foundation, is a nonprofit organization with the goal to educate students and people in the Web3 area, and also to help blockchain clubs in USA and also in Germany. Our newly founded blockchain club to leverage help with just building relationships to other clubs and also to sponsors, also to help build the educational part, the event part of the blockchain clubs. And yeah, do you want to introduce yourself, Tobias?
Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Tobias. I'm also from the TUM Blockchain Club, similar as Mark, also located in Munich and still studying. And currently diving into blockchain because my thesis will also revolve around it. So I'm happy I'm also here today to get some questions going and maybe get a better understanding of blockchain and all things around it.
All right. Yes, Camila, thanks for coming. You're from the Graph. As read, you are a developer advocate or a developer manager. Do you want to introduce yourself and what you're doing at the Graph? What is your role and where are you coming from? What made you get into the Graph and Web3 area?
Hey, yeah. So, hey everyone, my name is Cami. Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me, BAF. I'm a developer relations engineer at EduNode, who is a core developer of the Graph protocol. So, the Graph protocol has a bunch of different core developers, and EduNode is one of them. And that's where I work. So, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion or question of like, what is EduNode versus the Graph, or maybe some other core developers that you've heard of, like Masari or the Guild. So, they're all different core devs. And I have been over at the Graph for a few months now, and I do everything around education, developer content, and that includes things like giving talks, giving workshops, doing spaces like this to kind of interact with developers one-to-one and answer questions and support them in stuff that they're building. And on the topic of how I kind of landed at the Graph or how I got started in Web3 in general, before working in crypto, I worked in traditional software. I was an engineer at PayPal on the checkout team. And I just kind of started hearing about Web3 on Twitter around, when was this? Like the end of like November, October of 2021. And it was just kind of popping off on Twitter. So I just started learning on my own. I took the course from Buildspace and just wrote a blog about kind of what I learned. And yeah, that's kind of was my first introduction to actually building stuff with blockchain. And then a few months later, as I was kind of going through my own learning journey, I experimented with the Graph. And for me, I chose the Graph just as a starting point because I already knew GraphQL. It's a technology I was already familiar with. And then I knew that the Graph used GraphQL. So it just seemed like an easy enough place to start. And that was true. And I, again, ended up just writing a blog about what I learned and kind of how other people can start using the Graph. And a few weeks later, the Graph or EduNode reached out to me and was like, hey, this is really good. If you're, trying to work in Web3, we would love to have you. And so, yeah, and then I interviewed and joined the team.
Cool. Yeah, very interesting. Could you maybe explain to people how, like, what exactly are like the Graph, like what are the use cases of the Graph? How can people use it? And yeah, maybe what is like the starting point of the Graph, like for which kind of projects would you need it? Yeah.
Yeah, so the graph is an indexing and query protocol that allows developers to efficiently read data from the blockchain. And furthermore, it allows developers to make more sophisticated queries against this data. So if you've ever been on Etherscan and you've ever clicked on a contract and you go to read contract, you know that so you can make queries in that section where you can maybe type in a token ID and get like the IPFS hash, or I don't know, get the total number of tokens or something like that. Those are all queries that you're making. But you can't really ask more sophisticated queries like, give me the total number of tokens that have not been sold, or give me, like, I don't know, all of the tokens with red hair. These types of queries where you want to map relationships between entities, or you want to know, kind of go like one level deeper and maybe make some nested queries, you just can't do right now manually. Sorry, so you can do it. It's just like super complicated, and maybe we can talk about that later. But what the graph does, it allows you to do that super efficiently, super easily as a solo developer. It's something you could do in just a few minutes. And maybe I'll link it here. I have a talk up on YouTube where I talk about the graph and I do a live coding demo, and we build what are called subgraphs, which is what we call these APIs that are deployed on the graph, in like 12 or 15 minutes. So you can spin one up pretty fast and you just get access to this breadth of data that is the blockchain. And then it allows you to build applications with it. And sorry, you also asked kind of what are the use cases or what kind of applications could use the graph. So, I mean, it's really anything. I would say a lot of the applications that exist today are around DeFi and NFT projects, but this is just limited by people's, ability to be creative and build novel things. So, for example, in the course 30 Days of Web3, we're using a use case that's neither of these, and we're actually building an event management platform where, something like Eventbrite or Luma, where you can create an event and then other people can RSVP to it. In that project, we use the graph to get data about these events and these users, aka like who's RSVP'd, has the event already passed, what time and what day is the event. All of this is data that's on chain. And in order to show some sort of dashboard or to kind of like surface that data to your user on the client application, you need something in the middle. And that's what the graph does. So it allows you to make those types of queries, i.e., like, you know, list all of the events that have not happened yet and that this user has RSVP to. So you can use it for anything. It's like literally just limited by your own ability to be creative. And for me, I really have been pushing, and that's why we created the course this way, to see more use cases that are not just around DeFi and NFTs.
So if I got it correctly, in the main scope, you're focusing on providing environments or frameworks for other people to build information rich applications using blockchain data. Do you see any direct competitors, for example, that could possibly interfere with the graph's roadmap, or maybe also provide services that offer any alternatives to what the graph's service portfolio has? Or where do you see a possible differentiation from the graph to any competitors you might have?
Yeah, so there's a few different projects or protocols out there that are trying to do similar things, or even just projects that have built their own indexer, like Zora or like Lens. And part of that is, I think, just because the graph actually, one thing that's important to note is that the graph has a hosted service and then a decentralized network. So we announced a few weeks ago, or maybe months ago at this point, that we'll be sunsetting the hosted service and all subgraphs will have to migrate over to the decentralized network. And the hosted service came about as kind of a proof of concept to see if this thing actually works. And obviously it was successful. There's hundreds of subgraphs that have been deployed. So to answer your question, yes, there's other projects out there that are doing similar things, or maybe even projects that are building kind of their own built-in indexers. But I think what differentiates the graph is that it's decentralized, and at the graph, that really means something. They're super about the ethos of decentralization and it not just being like a word that we use, but rather making sure that every part of your technology stack is decentralized and kind of has more protection against the vulnerabilities that come with centralization.
So you said that you're planning on going more decentralized, and you started with your hosted services as a prototype. How are you seeing? Do you see any like issues scaling that and building it on top of like a decentralized structure? Because like for now, I've tried the graph a little bit, and like creating subgraphs like takes a lot of time kind of. But then obviously if you have it indexed and everything, you can quickly query it. But if you want to do everything on a decentralized structure, do you see any potential risks of performance issues, and how do you want to tackle them?
Not really. What do you mean by you tried to make a subgraph and it took a long time? Like the actual writing the code to make the subgraph?
No,
Or
like all the deployment and everything. Yeah,
okay, got it. Was this on the hosted service or on the
yeah,
network? Do you remember? On the hosted service?
yeah, I think so.
Okay, yeah. I don't know. I would love to take a look at what you're doing because it's not something that should take a long time at all. I mean, unless you're indexing like huge amounts of data, like a Uniswap type thing, that I've seen like have kind of performance issues around indexing time. But for your kind of like everyday applications, that shouldn't be a problem.
I mean, not the indexing, but like creating the subgraphs,
So writing the
taking
code.
I mean, like creating. I mean, yeah. If it's, I just like created like a quick prototype, and I just like saw like deploying the subgraph, and this like took a little bit. Obviously, if it's like all deployed, it takes like less time to index and query it. But yeah, like if you want to like switch from hosting services to like a decentralized kind of structure, is that like even possible, or is it still going to be efficient?
Yeah. So right now we have a team that's dedicated to helping people migrate if they want help or if they need help. But we also have a migration guide posted on our blog where people can just read through it and migrate their own subgraph if they have one on the hosted service and they want to migrate over to the network. And it's something that you should do. You should be, well, one, you should do because we're sunsetting that service anyway. So eventually you're going to have to, if, at least if you want to keep that service. But two, it's something that you can do in like 20-ish minutes.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
Maybe building on this. So since you said that you are also supporting people to migrate services and basically evolve with your portfolio and how your services are also evolving, in what ways are you specifically trying to teach people how to use the graph services, and how do you do so that it's really accessible and people, let's say, have an well, nice onboarding experience to use your services and implement them or integrate them into their actual product or portfolio?
Yeah, I think our docs are quite good, and I always kind of direct people to the docs as a starting point if they just want to kind of get oriented to like what is all the terminology, like what is indexing, just kind of like starting from the very beginning. But once you're in a place where you're like, okay, I'm ready to build a subgraph, we have guides that literally walk you step by step for how to, write a subgraph, how to deploy a subgraph, what the difference is between the hosted service and the network. And then me as a developer advocate, I personally and as part of the company have videos and blogs, and like I give talks almost like monthly at this point about the graph. And there's also Pranav who works with me. He's a solutions engineer. He also does a lot of talks more specifically around migrations. So yeah, I would say like a combination between docs and then just having direct access to the team for like just talking to us and asking questions is kind of how we make sure that users are getting a positive experience when they're working with the graph.
Mm-hmm. Okay, get it. So that's about the accessibility part. But how exactly do you convince people, so to say, to use your service? In the beginning, we also discussed that there are competitors. So I guess there might be some conflicts, or let's say decisions that have to be taken to use either or. So how do you make your solution stand out and convince people to opt for yours?
Yeah, I think for us, one thing that really stands out is that we use GraphQL. And again, like I said, most engineers who are working in crypto also have a background of engineering in Web 2. So they're most of the time already very familiar with GraphQL. And it just serves as a really easy point to pivot away from building their own indexers, which usually they don't want to do that anyway, or they have tried to do that and they realize that's way too hard and takes way too long. So I don't know. I would say from my perspective, doing DevRel, I've never really had to, I would say, like convince someone. It's kind of more I'm just, sharing my knowledge and what I know, and then people, kind of decide like if that's what works for them. Because in some cases, right, like subgraphs are really, really good because you're writing in assembly script, which is really close to JavaScript, and it's really easy to get started. We do all of the indexing for you. We kind of have that infrastructure for you to just define what data you're interested in. For other people, they might have a different set of use cases, which I don't even know like what they could be, but they might have other specification requirements where they're like, we would rather do this because maybe, for example, maybe our engineering team is, I don't know, doesn't like assembly script or doesn't like, this like subset of languages, and we'd rather not write in those languages. Something like that could happen. But I would say, like I said, most of the time I don't really feel like I'm convincing. It kind of just feels like I'm, giving a demo, and then people kind of see, either as a solo team or as a small team. If you're not like a fully fledged, like 30 plus person engineering team, it's really hard to justify writing your own indexer. So it kind of makes sense for most teams, I would say.
Okay, got it. So kind of speaks for itself, as far as I understand. Maybe one specific addition to this one. Do you see any worthwhile potential for cooperation with academic initiatives, especially like this one, BF, or also, academic research or something like this? How the graph could possibly support this or also benefit from students or PhD people using it?
Yeah, I have a background in education, so I'm always looking for ways to kind of connect the student community to what we're doing. And yeah, I think there's a lot of value in students like getting access to this, not only just the graph, but just having access to kind of all of the modern technologies that are out there in crypto and not in crypto. Because as you probably know, as being students, the biggest problem is that when you graduate, you're kind of have this like older, less sophisticated tech stack just because of the nature of universities, right? Like they're not able to keep up, and they just don't want to change their curriculum like every year. And there's also like a lot of logic to what they do. They're teaching you fundamentals, which give you the building blocks to adapt. So I think there's a lot of value in like getting modern stuff, especially either in crypto or not in crypto, but getting this in the hands of students so when they are ready to join the workforce, they actually have a modern tech stack that people have a demand for. And then for the graph specifically, I would say like we had our hackathon maybe 2 months ago or something, and we had a big focus on students. So we gave out free tickets to local students, and we had more to give out to any students who were in the Bay Area who wanted to come. So I think the graph as an org like sees the value in that. And I don't know, as far as research goes, I'm not super like deep into that world, but I'm sure there's like tons of benefits that could come with a closer relationship between like researchers in the student world and what we're doing.
Yeah, maybe one last specific question to this for education, just as I know from our university. So people are, for instance, running their own archive nodes to get a better access to blockchain data and stuff like. So this is something I could see where the graph and research could maybe get together to ease this access to data and yeah, do more interesting analysis on blockchain data. But thanks.
Yeah, coming back to like the application side of the graph, you said many of your customers are also B2B, and they have like production code running. How can you like assure for those production ready like company code that like all the so the question is how can you like guarantee like runtime and basically so if like some subgraphs like go down or like some nodes go down, how can you like guarantee that all of this like stays up in in a large scale production product?
Yeah, so that's kind of the shining star of the decentralized network is that the actual indexing. So there's like multiple indexers on this network that all compete to give you the most correct data at the best price. So on the network, you pay something called query fees, which are paid directly to the operators doing your indexing. So there's, we introduced this like market for people providing top-notch services, and then there's consequences for people who maybe return data that's incorrect or are not live when they should be. So there's that incentive. And I think that's like, a core part of crypto is like having these built-in incentives for whatever it is that we're trying to do. And then also on the note of like, how can you guarantee uptime for your nodes? So I actually am not like 100% like an expert in this part, but from my understanding, all of the different indexers are able to configure their own RPC providers. So there's not one standard for it, as in like, oh, everyone uses, I don't know, Infura or everyone uses Alchemy. They all are able to configure their own. So if there's ever, like I think a few weeks ago we saw some downtime with Alchemy, and then there's some downtime with Infura or something like that. They're able to configure and adjust in real time to maintain their status.
Okay, thanks. One question that's maybe a bit different, so to say. So I hope you have an interesting answer onto this one as well, as to the others. So since you are considering a lot of data and you're accumulating data from different sources and well, on a big scale, do you see a potential conflict when it comes to privacy? So as you may know, here in Europe, people are really concerned with privacy and data security and these kind of things. Especially when it's related to user data or data that is able to be related to persons or identities, or so to say. And do you see an issue here or possible measures that the graph is maybe already taking to counteract these issues?
Well, so the graph just indexes data that's available on whatever network you as the user are like interested in. So this could be mainnet, this could be a testnet, or it could be whatever, all these different networks that we support. So there's no sense of like, we will not index this data or you cannot index this data. Whatever is available on the network itself is able to be indexed. So that's probably a question for, I don't know, dApps, a question of like, what kind of data are we putting on chain versus what actually needs to be on chain. But the short answer is the graph can index anything that's out there. There's no limits on like, we will not index, I don't know, personal data or something, because it's user defined. So you as a developer define what it is that you want to index. The graph doesn't just index, everything. We index only what you as a developer want to index.
But do you, sorry, do
yeah,
you, do you like track the queries the users made? Like, do you like store the previous queries you made and like from the user side?
Does the graph itself store queries that are made? No. So you can, for example, like GraphQL has a caching ability, which like will cache, queries so that you can get faster responses. So like in that sense, there's that. But the graph itself isn't storing like the kinds of queries that people are making.
All right. So like mainly for caching and stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right.
One addition maybe to the privacy question. So as you probably know, there are some search engines, for instance, to search for faces on the internet, which sometimes are used for malicious purposes. That's basically where that question of mine came from. So obviously you can index anything that is on the web, and I guess it's reasonable to do so, but maybe it has some implications if you, let's say, increase the accessibility of this index data, which, for instance, these face search engines are doing. So that was the question. So if you see a potential issue of this index data being too accessible in case it is containing some, let's say, user-specific data or sensitive data, or I don't know what, that people put it out in the first place obviously is a different responsibility and not yours, but yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question around like content moderation and how much moderation should a protocol do. I think it's something that I would say, at least I would think, a lot of orgs are thinking about. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for like what the graph is going to do about it, because I don't even think it's something that like we've even fully finished thinking through. Obviously, at least for me and my personal like kind of mission and values is making sure that the tech that we build is safe and equitable and everyone can use it and it's not like dangerous to any group. So that's something that I care about deeply. And yeah, there's definitely, yeah, like you said, right? Like depending on the information that's put on chain or on any of these networks that the graph can index and query, there is the possibility of exposing personal data or exposing data that you just as a user might not even want out there in the first place, regardless of if it's indexed or not. So yes, I don't have a great answer for this because I just can't speak for the graph here, but it is something that I think about.
Okay, thanks.
Looking more in the future, what are the key milestones of the Graph's roadmap? What are you working on right now? And yeah, where would you need more developers to help you reach those milestones? And, yeah.
Yeah, so the biggest kind of thing in the roadmap right now is sunsetting the hosted service and getting as many subgraphs to migrate as possible. And then also with that, so on the hosted service, we support a variety of networks. And on the decentralized network, right now, we only support Ethereum mainnet. And we actually have our next chain being announced tomorrow, I believe. And slowly but surely, the team is building in support for all of the different networks that we supported on hosted on the network. So I would say that's like the biggest thing that we have in the roadmap for the next, I would say, year is like getting all of the support onto the network and actually making it a place where people can build subgraphs on. Because, for example, right now, if you wanted to build, if you wanted to use the graph to do something on Polygon and you wanted to use the network, right now it's just not possible because we don't have support for that network yet. So that's like the biggest thing. And then I would say another really cool development that we've had recently is the introduction of substreams, which was created by Streaming Fast, which is another core developer of the Graph protocol. And what they did is they built out these really cool composable modules that change the way that we write subgraphs, and they increase indexing performance by 100 times. So that's a pretty huge improvement given that, like I said earlier, for some subgraphs, they were kind of suffering from slow indexing speeds just because they were indexing so much data. And due to the nature of the way we were indexing is all of this had to be done linearly. So if you were indexing, like 15 million blocks or however many blocks there are now, maybe 16 million, you would have to index each block one by one, waiting for the previous block to finish until you could start the next one. So obviously this is not great. Like the complexity grows linearly as the number of blocks grows, which is not great. But with substreams, with the technology that they created, which is the ability to create these composable modules, you can parallelize the indexing of all of these different blocks. So that's pretty cool. That's, I would say, the next biggest thing that is in the roadmap because right now it's in developer preview and pretty soon it'll be out released in the wild for developers to start working with.
Thanks for this key point. So we also had another question kind of related to this. As you mentioned, there is a potential issue of scaling onto large data sets or big blockchains. And as we all know, the Ethereum project is evolving and in their final shape, as per some people are planning to support up to 100,000 transactions per second, which obviously incurs a lot of data. So do you see an issue in the long run regarding this specific nature of blockchain scaling when it comes to these projects being more mature and reaching higher bandwidths and also wider adoption? So maybe there's an ever larger portion of people or developers, projects whatsoever that are requesting specific subgraphs of yours and, by this incurring a lot of computation and storage and whatsoever load.
Yeah, so if I understood your question, you kind of cut out for me a little bit, so I missed a part, but I think I got what you were saying. Um, Really, substreams is like the answer to this, and it's been something that the graph has been hearing for months, maybe even longer, just like complaints about slow indexing and it not really being performant for applications that are super, super like take up a lot of data. And that was like the number one complaint that we were getting. And for the longest, we were telling people we were working on this, like we're aware of it. And now, thankfully, we have substreams out. So I did a talk on substreams in Paris, this last ECC at a side event called Dataverse. And I can find the video and link it in this space in a second. So if you want to learn about substreams, you can kind of watch that talk and kind of get into it more of like how exactly you're able to parallelize transactions and what changed between how we are currently doing things and how you will be able to do things in the near future. Let me know if I didn't answer your question.
I think you did. So basically, my question was exactly around this scaling issue. Just maybe kind of twofold. So one is, as you already answered, I think there's the performance point of the blockchain ecosystem, which has to be considered because blockchains are getting more powerful and there's more data produced or consumed. But my second question, maybe you can specifically try to tackle this one. If you might see an issue with wider adoption. So let's say the blockchain ecosystem is adopted into general purpose topics. Every day people are using blockchains. There's so much data produced and a possibly infinite amount of subgraphs requested for this or that kind of data.
Yeah, is your question like how will you be able to manage the like large influx of subgraphs?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so
in parallel, so I mean, as I would expect, there's a large amount, and the complexity of those subgraphs is possibly quite big in the future.
yeah. So I would say the first point is the fact that it's a permissionless network where anyone can join as any of the different roles. So you can be an indexer, you can be a fisherman, you can be a curator, and yeah, maybe we can get into what those mean a little bit later, but they're not super important to know for this context. But basically what I'm saying is if you saw this, basically if the demand is higher than the supply, as in like if there were more people requesting indexing than the network could handle because there weren't enough indexers, that would shoot prices up because of the nature of supply and demand. But then also what that would signal is that more people can join the network as indexers and have good incentives to provide these. So like short answer is just natural like supply and demand, like hopefully free market will adjust itself to the like climbing demands of the need for subgraphs. But also on kind of like a computation side, asking how will we be able to kind of manage this, I think we're still like extremely far away from having that kind of problem where like the network from a computation standpoint can't handle that many like requests. I think we're still like super, super far away from that. And what will happen when we get there? Honestly, I have no idea. I haven't even thought like that far because we're so incredibly far away from that like threshold.
Got it. Thanks. That's another interesting point you're bringing up. So where would you personally see the graph in something like, let's say, 10 years? So what's your personal stance on the next big milestones and what are the great achievements we might have seen in 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think for me, I would love to see support for all of the different networks and all of the different L1s that are popping up. I think as we head to a more multi-chain future, we'll need to support all of these different chains and kind of give developers the freedom to build where they want. And I think right now we're going through this phase where developers are kind of figuring out like, am I an Ethereum maxi? Am I like a multi-chain person? Am I open to trying new chains? I think that's where like a lot of people are right now, where they're kind of seeing that for kind of at least for me, like for the first time, there's a lot more options of where to build with like high performance than there were before. So now you have a lot of different options. And I think for me, success for the graph would look like having support for all of these networks like quickly so that builders, relatively quickly can continue to use the graph regardless of whatever network they're building on. Um, and yeah, like I don't know, in 10 years, I would love to see that being like the base kind of API layer for every decentralized application because it's easy enough to use and it's like at that point will be super highly performant even for really high like production level applications. So I think that's what success looks like. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Mark and me, I think we have pretty much one very concrete last question and would then move to the open Q&A. So to all the audience, if you have some questions, feel free to prepare yourself already to ask them in a minute. And now off to the last question. So could you name one key benefit or risk that generally just comes to your mind when you think about Web3, the graph, your personal role in Web3, Web3's adoption in general, or anything like this? So very open-minded, but so what would be the key benefit you could see in this regard, and what's the key risk that, I don't know, might keep you from sleeping in the night, or I don't know, hopefully not
Yeah.
that bad.
Yeah. I think the key benefit or one of the key benefits is really honestly for me, it's like having this global network and this like permissionless peer-to-peer payment system that just didn't exist before. And I talked about this a little bit at Graph Day, but just the concept of like without crypto, you have to send money through a bank or through, I don't know, Western Union or something. And there's just so many hoops that you have to jump through. And if there's sanctions, if there's like blocks on, you know, certain countries or certain groups of people, like women having access to bank accounts, like that's a huge problem. And I think for me, that's the biggest value proposition of crypto is this permissionless peer-to-peer network where anyone in the network can directly send and receive data to and from anyone else in the network without an intermediary. And then I would say the thing that like is questionable or is up in the air right now is I would say it's a combination of kind of like regulation that maybe keeps me awake at night these days is like what is going to happen in all these countries, including here where I live in the States. And also from a developer's perspective is just like the space and the technology is so nascent. It's changing almost daily at this point. And it's kind of hard to, I would say, convince people to come over here and start building where if they start building like the next day their thing is going to be out of date or they have to upgrade their version or they have to roll back a version because their upgrade didn't work. I would say that's kind of like the hardest thing to deal with as a developer.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much. I think you answered most of our questions, and I would say we go it now to the audience. If you have questions.
So while we wait for some question, this is Alexis from BAF. I was wondering if the graph is hiring and if you have any resources for students, how they can get engaged with the graph.
Yeah, so the graph is definitely always hiring. Like I said, I think there's 6 now core developers. So all those teams, I think they're all like I would say they're all hiring right now. I haven't looked and checked every single one, but from my experience, there's always some job openings. And for students, I would say I don't know if there would be any jobs like specifically outlined for students, but the cool thing about crypto is that if you can just kind of prove your skills and if you know how to do the job, then it doesn't really matter if you're a student or not. Like I said earlier, like the way I joined the graph is I just wrote a cool blog and they liked it. So and they asked me to work there. So I think everyone can have a similar path where it's like whether you're a student or you're like, you know, graduated or whatever the case may be. I think if you can do the job and you're like passionate about it, then I think you're totally in the running for getting a position.
Thank you.
Brandon, you had a question?
I think in these Twitter spaces, you have to assign people the right to talk, right? I think otherwise, oh yeah, okay.
I think he's already a speaker. Okay. Maybe until then, let me ask quickly, where can you find the graph? Are you represented at conferences or hackathons? How can we reach out to you?
Yeah, the graph is at most hackathons, I would say. So you can look out for our graph booth. We usually have a booth. And then on Twitter, you can find us at Graph Protocol. And there you can tweet us. The DMs of the account are open. And also my DMs are open always. And I think I do a pretty good job of getting back to people who have questions about the graph. And I'm always happy to jump on a call or, you know, pair with you if you're having trouble getting your subgraph up.
Cool. Is the graph also giving away grants for projects which build on the graph?
Yes, we do have a grants program, and we have an ongoing application that is checked kind of in different waves. So that's always open, and builders and people, anyone can always send in their application for a grant.
Cool. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Doesn't seem so. Maybe I can raise one back to you personally. So originally, I mean, going some years back, what made you personally get in touch with this Web3 thing in the first place? So I'm not sure how it is in US, how natural it just comes to you, but in Germany, it's not that natural. Let's say it that way.
Yeah, I just found it through Twitter, honestly. I was just like following some people who started talking about it. And like I said, at this point, I was at PayPal. So at that point, actually, it lined up with where PayPal and Venmo was introducing a crypto wallet in Venmo itself. So I was kind of just hearing about it from different directions through work and then through people I knew on Twitter. So it was pretty informal, just kind of how I started learning about it. And then, like I said, I just took a course and just really started having fun again building. It's like I was, in a super corporate-y engineering job before, and crypto just felt like kind of how you feel when you first start learning how to code, where it's like so exciting and you're getting this thing to run. And that's kind of how I felt and why I like became really passionate about it.
Sounds very interesting. Maybe an added question to that one. So personally, I also, before starting my master's, worked at a very old school industrial engineering company. Um, do you have any experiences on getting in touch with them, considering your background now with the graph? And do you see any culture differences or something? And are there issues to overcome, or is it also just coming naturally, as you earlier mentioned? People just use it, build it, feel it's useful, and then just go ahead.
Yeah, culturally, I think between the worlds, like the whole Web 2 versus Web 3, even though I hate that comparison, like I think it's appropriate here because we're talking about cultural differences. Yeah, there's super notable differences. Like I would say it sounds like kind of naive or like simple, but everyone in crypto is like super cool. And I think it's because we're all aligned from a value standpoint. Like we all value certain things. That's why we're in crypto. That's why we're like working to build this future. Whereas maybe in like traditional software, you're obviously right, you're working with like all different types of people. You're working with people who have similar views as you. You have people who have opposing views as you. So I think the fact that we have this shared like value system is what makes everyone seem so cool. And it's really just that we all like have this shared belief system. So I would say that's the biggest thing for me is like constantly being around people who are like in my little circle of beliefs and values. And then the other one is I would say is like crypto has been, at least in my experience, it's very much more based on meritocracy rather than like who you know or what college you went to or if you went to an Ivy League or like whatever, like how many internships you've had. In Web 2, when I was first starting out, it was super hard to even get an interview at these tech companies. And you would even see on these applications, they have a drop down where it's like, what school did you go to? And it'd be like Stanford, Berkeley, like whatever. I don't even know the other Ivy Leagues. And then those were the only options. And then other. So it's like they had this predisposition to Ivy Leaguers, or they had this predisposition to like a certain type of student they were looking for, which made it really difficult for if you weren't one of those students, which I wasn't, to even, get a call for like a screener interview. So I would say in crypto that is not the case. And it's very much so based just on your skills and your abilities and a lot less based on your like prestige of your school or like how, I don't know, how many good research papers you've written or something like that.
Cool. Are there any more questions from the audience?
There's another guy that was just assigned the right to speak. So if that works, just go ahead, I guess, unmute yourself and just let us know what you want to know.
Yeah, sure. So full disclosure, I've heard of GraphQL, but I hadn't sort of really taken a peek until just the last 10-15 minutes or so. This is, if the label is on the box here, and that is what I think it is, this is incredibly useful. You know, I've been old school crypto, sort of 2008, 2009, and you know, took a break for a decade and just sort of circling back now. But I've been, I got to be honest, pretty disappointed with a lot of the user interfaces and the infrastructural efforts in terms of accessibility. I think it's tremendously important, not just to build standards and procedures for, you know, the devs here, in terms of just like, you know, building like a common indexing protocol, I think is really important. But it also sets the tone for new projects, right? So turning up with a new idea and looking to build, you know, not just an application, but like if you're going to build a protocol, man, it's like it's less like writing a haiku, and it's more like inventing an alphabet, right? And so having sort of a pool of actors who are independent, who are sort of agreed broadly to sort of you know, build infrastructure in this fashion to allow for a degree of interoperability and sort of fairly sort of chain agnostic, but also fairly, I want to say, horizontal approaches is tremendously important. At the risk of this sort of turning into a friendly, I'm trying to find a nice way to say a term. At the risk of this giving us ourselves too many compliments, one question I would have is, if you sort of look, like, to the extent that you've lived in this area longer than probably most people in the room, what feels like the big vision to you if you sort of push forward? Are you thinking sort of 5 years? Are you thinking 10 years? Are you thinking 10 weeks? And then and if you were to sort of chop it up into phases, what feel like the material, the largest sort of inflection points, right? Whether it's like, here's how an individual uses it and that's cool, or like, here's how an aggregate might use it, or a community, or here's like a certain kind of actor which just cannot use it right now because the value isn't there, but at a certain level of adoption there's certain triggers. Like, how do you sort of frame the future as it applies to these kinds of technologies, and which parts are you most excited about?
Yeah. I would say, like, for me, this might not be exactly what you're asking, because I think maybe you're asking like from maybe an infrastructure point of view. But yeah, just let me know if I don't answer your question. But I think for me, like, next, 5 or 10 years, really, I would love to see 5. It might be like closer to 10, but having widespread adoption in places like Latin America and in countries in Africa and really in just places that are outside of North America and Europe, where there's actually a bigger use for this like permissionless payment system that we have, that yes, we use it here, but and I'm actually writing a piece about this right now, but it's like, you hear a lot of anti-crypto people like kind of scoffing and rolling their eyes and being like, oh, this is just for like rich white boys, or whatever, crypto bros, the whole notion of crypto bros. But really, there's like a whole world of people who actually have a lot more use for crypto than we do, because we do have the privilege of having a secure financial infrastructure, and whereas like other countries don't, mixed with a lot of other conditions as well, right? It's like, we talk about some countries women can't have bank accounts. We talk about some countries where women are legally allowed to have bank accounts, but there's social and cultural norms around actually being able to execute that, and just a whole bunch of stuff. So for me, like, next 10 years is widespread adoption, where people in other parts of the world, the global south, Latin America, have access to crypto and are actually like using it. And kind of your other question is like, what are the pieces that need to happen to make that happen? For me, like, we need to get to a place of UX and technology where your everyday mom and pop shop can accept crypto and there's no notion of this is crypto. Like, it doesn't feel different, it doesn't look different. There's no different operations that need to happen for this, like,
It should be invisible, right?
yeah, it should be invisible, and like we should have easy on and off ramps for these businesses so that they can, effectively use it.
Yeah, I'm often an analogy I often use is the old Linux is the OS, right? Like if you ask most people what the most popular OS is, the general response is Microsoft Windows or iOS. But like by virtue of the fact it's on Linux is on every Android, well, by scope and volume, it's the most popular OS, right? But people don't know that they're using it. It's just it happens to work. It happened to be the cheapest at the time, and there's more of it than anything else in the world within this particular category. And so, it feels like success to me feels like actually boredom. It feels like this is pedestrian. And I guess we to the extent that we each sort of specialize in different areas, right? Whether it's sort of DeFi or even DLaw and increasingly DGov. There's all these sort of interesting inflection points and sort of challenges and opportunities. Some of them born of where new old system breaks old system. Some of them where new system fixes or sort of supports rather than supplants old systems. And I guess I wonder, like, are there any sort of particular areas that you might sort of have insight into that other folks with similar technologies in different applications might not have spent so much time thinking about that that have been percolating on your mind recently?
I would say the biggest thing that's been on my mind, but probably I definitely don't have like any, info that other people don't have because I'm definitely not an expert. I'm sure there's like a bunch of teams that know way more about this than me, but the place where I'm at is kind of what I mentioned earlier, specifically around Latin America because I'm Colombian and it's just what I know about and what I have a lot of experience with. But I was just doing research, like I said, for this written piece that I'm working on, and I'm probably going to fudge the numbers because I'm not reading it, but it's something like, Latin America accounts for like a huge percentage of total global remittance payments.
Oh yeah.
Despite only being like, I don't know, 12 or I don't know, under 20% of the global population, they're like contributing to, I think, more than half of global remittance.
Yeah, lion's share for sure.
Yeah, and it's like for certain countries, I think it's like, I want to say like Guatemala and like Honduras or something like that. It makes up like more than half of their GDP is just like, cross-border payments that they're getting from people in America. So for me, that's like the thing that is really on my mind, and like what I would love to like see more of a focus on in my echo chamber, at least.
Yeah, I think the accessibility and the diversity that comes with it is really important, right? Any other hot takes in the room around some of these questions? They're broad, but deliberately so. Trying to capture a few gems. Curious as to what you got here. Big picture stuff. Blue ocean.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. If there's anyone who wants to add something to that.
I can do that thing where somebody asks a question, but really they want to answer their own question. If you like, it won't suck. I promise. So I feel like there's like two numbers that are useful for understanding currencies, whether they're fiat or crypto or whatever, right? One is like how many people who could have a wallet do have a wallet, whether that's like a physical wallet in your back pocket or whether it's like some sort of crypto wallet, with the sort of rough idea that like the more people who have access to the more people who are capable of interacting with this thing, well, the larger the pool is, right? And so, to the best of my understanding, there's like somewhere between 60 million and like 800 million wallets, which is somewhere between like 1% and 0.1% of 8 billion people, which is cool. It's a lot more than 0.0001%, but it's still pretty small, right? So I think like to the extent that we can sort of expand that, lower the engagement barriers, that's really cool. But like the second number that I think is really important is within like a 24-hour period, for example, or like let's say a week, what percentage of a particular currency is, if you look at the transactions, are like one of two classes. Class A, which is like money being exchanged for other forms of money, and Class B, literally everything else, products, goods, and services, and so on. And the basic premise is that like the more that it's in that latter category, the more of a currency it feels like, right? Because like you can earn whatever coin you want, but if you can't pay your rent, if you can't, get a coffee or a bagel or whatever it is that you want to do with your life, and if the only way to realize the value of a currency is to trade it into another currency, then you're sort of it's less of a currency, right? And so I get really excited about people building protocols that expand into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like boring stuff like food, shelter, rice, stuff like that. One moment. Sorry, quietly dying over here. Yeah, and so I guess I think of protocols like this, which are building tooling to allow not just dev teams to build better projects for themselves with greater cohesion, greater alignment, but also to allow people to turn up and participate without having to build and rebuild and rebuild, like reinvent the wheel a time and again with sort of private servers and custom software and so on. That feels really important to me, right? I think one of the big shifts that we're going from is like this environment of vertical stacks on closed data sets to horizontal stacks on open data sets. And so the more open those data sets are and the more horizontal those tech stacks are, I think we sort of expand this idea of freedom to the individual to the extent those freedoms don't impinge upon the freedoms of others, presumably. So that's what I'm super excited about, man.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. A lot of possibilities for the future with that. And yeah, I would wrap this whole thing up and would say follow Blockchain Acceleration Foundation on Twitter for more educational talks with frontier Web3 companies. Follow the TUM Blockchain Club on Twitter. We will also be doing speaker talks, fireside talks, and yeah, thank you, Camilla, very much for coming. It's very interesting what you told us about GraphQL. Very useful technology. And thanks for coming. Yeah, thanks for Bart for the opportunity. Let's wrap it up. Camilla, do you want to give some? How can we find you on Twitter, or how can we find the graph?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter here at Cami and this thing. I also same handle for YouTube and TikTok, and then for the Graph, you can follow Graph at Graph Protocol on Twitter, and they actually also made a TikTok recently, so you can follow them on there too.